Welcome, everybody. This is Darin Francis from Harbinger Lane, and this is Signals in Higher Ed. And today I am joined by Melissa Leavitt and Kevin Grubb from Strada Education. Welcome to you both.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Let's just start by having you each introduce yourselves and your roles at Strada and the work that you're doing. Melissa, why don't we just begin with you?
Yeah, it's great to be here. So my name is Melissa Leavitt. I am a vice president on our quality coaching team at Strada Education Foundation. And quality coaching, as we refer to it, is really kind of encompassing all of the different information, resources, support services that fall into kind of a big bucket of guidance that students need to connect their education to a career. So a lot of my work focuses on working directly with higher ed institutions. It's probably the absolutely best part of my work to be able to just support those institutions and learn from them on how they're implementing this kind of career guidance that we're talking about.
And I'm Kevin Grubb. I'm the vice president of work-based learning at Strada. And my role on the team of work-based learning is to focus on how institutions and systems of institutions can advance policy and practice that would scale work-based learning. And when we think about work-based learning at Strada, we're thinking about things like internships and co-ops and apprenticeships and practica like student teaching and nursing clinicals. So opportunities for students to really experience things in the workplace setting and apply what they're learning from the classroom to work. And prior to Strada, I worked on a college campus myself and was a chief career officer. So throughout this conversation, I might be bringing in some insights that I'm learning from the work at Strada and from our partners in the field, as well as my own background doing some of this work on campuses. So big passion for this and excited to be talking about it today with you, Darin.
That's awesome. And it's why I wanted you guys to be on, because we've been going through, as you know, a series focused on experiential learning, work-based learning. And we started with the companies, a lot of companies that are doing really interesting stuff in the higher ed space. And now we're starting to move over slowly into also including a lot of the higher ed champions in the space, whether they're at individual institutions or people like yourselves who are actually trying to help facilitate meaningful change in this direction. And I think it's really important to kind of, because so much of this is, to me, there's so much linking career guidance with work-based learning that I love that you guys have these two separate roles, but I also imagine you're gonna work a bit together. So we'll unpack that. But maybe we just should also start, either one of you can answer this, but just for listeners who may not be as familiar with Strada, help me understand the organization's mission and purpose. And I know you're structured across 5 areas: quality coaching, work-based learning, affordability, clear outcomes, and employer alignment. But how does that structure reflect where you see higher education needing the most support right now?
Yeah, happy to take that one. So at Strada, we're really focused on strengthening the connection between education and opportunity. And I think that's really just another way of saying that we are committed to ensuring that all students can succeed in post-secondary education, but also that completing a degree is not enough. So where we really put our focus and attention and resources is really on ensuring that post-secondary education can be that pathway that students take to achieve the career of their dreams and ultimately the lives that they envision for themselves. So you mentioned the 5 focus areas. I know they're kind of a mouthful, and a good way to sort of think about what does that structure mean in terms of how we work with institutions and organizations and others is that it's really kind of a collection of connected sort of student-facing practices, so things that are going to directly impact the student experience, anchored by a couple sort of foundational practices or conditions that really need to be in place to make it all possible. So for their student-facing practices, it's really kind of boils down to 3 essential ingredients that students need in order to connect their education to career opportunity. And so that is clarity and transparency on the cost of higher ed. That's our affordability piece. Guidance on how to connect education to career, and work-based learning so they can begin to get the skills and experiences and networks to really support them in their professional lives. And then those 2 kind of anchoring pieces, one is, like you mentioned, clear outcomes. So that's really just about connecting data systems across education, career, salary information, institutional data, public data sources, and making it really actionable in a way that can just drive decision making. And then last, but absolutely not least, we have our employer alignment work, which is about strengthening relationships between industry and higher ed, as well as trying to bring higher ed programs into alignment with workforce needs. So across all those, we want to be working at scale. We want to drive toward large scale systemic change. And we have kind of a number of levers that we use to work through that.
I've known about Strada's work in over the years, and I've seen, the impact. I've seen people get, at different institutions get grants and that kind of thing through Strada. But it's actually really great to dive in deeper here. Well, kind of peeling back some more of the layers of how you both would sort of interact maybe a little bit. Why don't we explore this? So how do you see your two areas informing each other, or how should they be informing each other, whichever is the best way to think about that?
I will take that one and say that we definitely see these things informing each other very much. And there are lots of overlaps and intersections between the focus areas of Strada. This one might be the most fun because it is all tied to very directly the student experience and their understanding of career options, and then their experiencing or testing those career options, which is a lot of fun to think about what that is like for them. And a good example of how these things intersect is in the data that we've collected on work-based learning over the years in lots of studies and with lots of partners in the field. One thing we know that is a barrier to students participating in work-based learning is a lack of awareness of the options that are out there for them. And that is absolutely something that strong coaching can help ameliorate. That's a barrier that we could make less by having students have access to really great support from advisors, coaches, faculty, mentors. So the more that we can build that into the experience, the more that we have a chance that students will participate in work-based learning. And then on the other side of things, as a student completes a work-based learning experience, it is ideal, if they can get back to a coach or someone who can guide and support them to make sense of that experience. What did I learn? What can I now do that was different from before? How might that inform my next choice about what I do in my career? How does that align to the labor market today? What opportunities exist? So these things certainly feed each other and have a back and forth relationship that we want to make sure that we're able to help our partners maximize. So while we operate in different technical verticals and focus areas, we know there's a lot of these things that blend into each other in real life, and want to see that happen.
And maybe either of you could kind of talk about this too, but Kevin, given your background, we are starting to see some really progressive career services organizations emerge. I was just speaking with somebody at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania the other day and hearing about how their career services area is actually folds under the enrollment office, and the enrollment office is actually responsible for everything from enrollment through retention. And so it makes sense when you have that framing to put career services in that mix. But that was really interesting. But also seeing a lot of innovation in the sense that not just traditional academic units, but some of the provost offices are sort of focusing in new ways on student success and using kind of the career services area as sort of a launch point for innovation. I'm curious, what's your read on the ground? What are you excited about trend wise in these areas? Maybe you can explain what you think is behind some of that.
I'm very excited about the ways that institutions are starting to think about the career services function and where it lives, or how we elevate the work that it does. So a lot of the moves that you're talking about, like where does it report and what is that ultimate unit responsible for, feeds a lot of what that office is then enabled to do. So I know some examples of career services functions that report up through advancement. And a significant reason for that might be that there's such an external arm to that office, typically, right? That might be a great connection, then might ease a lot of access to employers. Because that office is already so externally focused, or that division is so externally focused. Of course, the provost area and the academic area would embed it in the heart of the student experience. So there's lots of ways that it can be advanced and prioritized. I think what is the most exciting to watch about this is how it's being elevated as a priority. So, and not just thinking about the career services office, but also how the institution thinks about career readiness, career preparedness, the activities that go into making sure a student has what they need to get that outcome they're looking for. So the goal there, I think, is really to consider how a senior level leader becomes bottom line accountable for career outcomes, so that they can be talking to the IT office, the institutional research office, financial aid, career services, faculty, and the academic portfolio, so that these things can be sort of woven together as really part of a lot more people seeing it as a priority, and not something that, one office is primarily responsible for over here, right? But that it becomes sort of this is part of the fabric, right? And having someone who's more senior at the institution be able to reach across the divisions and connect pieces around this is so critical. So I think that's an interesting thing to be watching, the sort of movement around more chief career officers or more cabinet level leaders being assigned responsibility to career, which gives it the push.
Something that happens that's really exciting when that career services office or unit gets elevated is that it really, I think, becomes a resource hub for the whole institution. So it's not just providing services to students or thinking about how to kind of make those practices more kind of foundational to the student experience, even though that's critical, but it's also becoming a resource hub for faculty, for staff, for leadership to infuse that career readiness everywhere into every function of the institution.
In my work at Harbinger Lane, I work with a lot of startups and companies that are working on go-to-market strategy and trying to learn maybe some of the best ways to position their products in market in a complex market like higher ed. And so I've, probably come across Strada from your portfolio company perspective more than I've come across you all, right? And so, but I am curious. I know that there's not a direct link to that side of the house for you, but how connected are each of you in your work with these portfolio companies? Is influencing solutions for the market a part of your roles in any way, or does that happen in other ways at Strada?
I'll take a first shot at this one and invite Melissa to jump in too. We are certainly involved in the conversation about our portfolio companies. We know our portfolio companies, especially the ones that are in the market trying to solve the same sorts of problems we're solving. And we talk with our great colleagues on the strategic investments team inside Strada a lot about sort of the solutions they're seeing, the problems we're seeing, and how those things come together. And influencing solutions is significant to us. We know that technology, for example, can play a significant role in expanding access to the things that we're talking about and creating more connective tissue between education and employment that might not exist. Technology can be a great enabler of that. And at the same time, we know that our institution partners have a range of problems to solve and may need a lot of different types of approaches to solve them, which may lend themselves to different types of technology. So as an example, we will not necessarily endorse or push one over another, because we are focused on our partners in the field and what is the greatest need for them, and what is the solution that's really going to work to get more quality coaching to be experienced by students, and to get more work-based learning to be experienced by students and employers, make that connection real. So we're very connected to it and very supportive of it, and are thrilled for our portfolio companies when they do well. And our central goal is making sure that the student impact happens, the student experience is changed, and that may require a lot of solutions that exist out there.
A couple of things I would add to that. One would be, I think, maybe the most important thing that I can do in that space is really hear from institutions and really listen when they share with me sort of what are they looking for, what informs their decision making about a platform. If I know sort of as much as possible about what's out there, I can really kind of support that and always kind of file away, okay, what kind of challenge are they having here? What was a priority that they were looking for there? How did it go? And sort of getting the tool onboarded. And I think that just sort of feeds back into everything we do. And then the other thing I would note is that, I mentioned all the different focus areas that Strada works in. We're working for large scale change. We work at systems level. So there are a lot of different approaches that we have. Strategic investments is an important component of that. We also do grant making. We do research. We advance public policy solutions. So to what Kevin said, these are large issues, and And we're trying to really, I think, drive change on a large scale. So it takes a lot of different approaches. And I think at Strada, we really try to kind of bring that all together and have it be informed by what we're doing in the field.
And I think now that I have a better picture for kind of Strada more holistically in these areas, why don't we just dig in a little bit on first on work-based learning, and then we'll kind of oscillate between these two different areas with you guys, but on the quality coaching as well. But Kevin, there's a question that institutional leaders are asking, and it's, what's the research actually show about the outcomes of work-based learning? If we're going to get to the point of scaling this in some really strategic ways, how certain are we that retention, completion, employment outcomes, even starting salaries are actually impacted in a positive way, when you roll out this kind of approach?
It's a very important question to be thinking about, that these practices we're trying to scale do the thing we want them to do, right? Many models of work-based learning exist with various levels of intensity and connection to employers. So there's lots of different kinds of benefits you might get out of different models. Strada's done a good amount of research on this particularly, and thinking about work-based learning and how it connects directly to, in our case, employment outcomes, helping students get out of underemployment, and a connection to earnings, the linkage to stronger earnings. So we have that research that evidences for us directly from Strada's studies, particularly on paid internships, being something that is very likely to get students out of underemployment. It's linked to higher earnings for students. So for us, that's a practice that we certainly want to advance, knowing that there's the evidence base for it. There's other great literature out there beyond ours that we also cite and speak to around models like apprenticeships and co-ops, as well as practica. I mentioned that at the top of the call, but things like student teaching and clinicals, we know those are required work-based learning experiences for certain pathways. So we want to advance those things. Some of the difficulty there from an access perspective is those are often unpaid. So that makes it a challenge for everyone to access those pathways. And that's an issue, we want to think about tackling. So there's great research out there on a number of the things that you mentioned. There's a lot of research on Strada's website. I'd love for people to go to the work-based learning page on Strada's website and explore a lot of the research that we have there that may help guide people at least toward the evidence on the employment outcomes of some of these models, because that's certainly where our strongest focus is.
And I think appropriate talking to Strada, talk about things from an equity lens. And I mean, you already kind of mentioned paid versus unpaid, but there's also sort of I don't know if it's a tension or if it's just a strategic vehicle of operation, but it feels like a tension sometimes between whether or not going curricular versus co-curricular or extracurricular is the right path for work-based learning opportunities, especially from an equity perspective. But how do you help an institution sort of sort through that kind of a question and the principles kind of underlying that from an equity standpoint?
What we really have identified for us as a big goal to move forward and toward is thinking about, there's essentially we see a supply gap and we see a pay gap. So there are students doing great quality work-based learning. Sometimes it's embedded in curriculum, like the ones I mentioned, student teaching and nursing clinicals, and those are unpaid. And that creates an issue. And then we have the supply gap where there are just not enough experiences out there, right? There are students who are still finishing their degrees and have not completed a really strong work-based learning experience. So from the perspective of access for everyone, we think about those two things as critical. And we certainly celebrate people thinking about wanting to put work-based learning directly in the curriculum. And when we think about that, it's which are the models that are going to lend themselves to being right for that curriculum and right for that student, based on what is the industry that they're likely linked to, what is the pathway, what is the kind of work-based learning that industry most often, produces or behaves with. So that's important. And then to think about what are the goals that the institution has in mind for embedding it in curriculum. Equity certainly is one if we're getting those students' experiences. And then we need to think about the evidence of whatever those models are that they're creating. Is the evidence for that very strong in retention and learning and belonging? Is the evidence for that really strong in direct connection to employment and earnings? So to think about sort of the mix of work-based learning you're offering relevant to the type of goals that you have, that's really important to pursue.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess kind of to dovetail off of that, I'm wondering about where are the obvious points of friction for deploying different models, right? Because I mean, there's when you go curricular, you've got the faculty senate that needs to approve. When you go co-curricular, you've got to think about some of these dynamics and so yeah, like where do you feel like institutions typically hit that friction point around this stuff, and how do you help them think through that?
For all of them, it's different. So that's sort of the sticky part, right? It's not a one size fits all answer. Work-based learning is not a one size fits all answer, and the challenges you might experience are not a one size fits all solution either. So I can think of institutions that are very industry embedded, very connected to it, have models that sort of presuppose that the institution is doing this, like a strong co-op school, for example, or a community college that has a very strong apprenticeship, pathway and infrastructure, versus others that might not be established that way. So the resistance you're going to meet is going to be different. The challenges you're going to meet are different. I think what can happen sometimes in these conversations that I'm always sensitive to, and I've many faculty friends, is that people may say, oh, the faculty are going to resist this. And that is certainly possible. There are, I'm sure, examples of that, right, that we could all point to. And yet I also think that faculty do have the best interests of students at heart. And many of them do believe that experiential learning more broadly, right, and work-based learning would be a subset of that, is really valuable. So if we come to the table thinking that and understanding that, we can get a little bit curious about, if we're saying, let's say, faculty are resistors, well, why? Is it because they don't have enough, that we're not giving them enough time to adequately plan a really good learning experience to go along with that work experience? That's really important, because if we scale non-quality work-based learning, or things where students don't learn, we have not achieved the goal. So if we need those folks to have more time to think about how to make sure it's quality, good, right? They should resist us. They should resist that movement, because we don't want it to just be a not valuable experience for the student. So there are points of resistance potentially in curriculum that we might be a little bit more curious about. What's the reason behind that, right? And what's the way to solve for whatever the underlying resistance there is? The other certainly could be employers and the infrastructure around employers. How can they stand up those experiences? Do they have enough time? Do they have enough supervisors to supervise students? Do they have the funding, right, to offer pay to students in those situations? So those are our two constituencies that I think we really need to think about when we talk about scale, and when we talk about what is going to be impactful, and who do we really need to be thinking about these things carefully.
Yeah, well said. I mean, and the diversity of institution types in the U.S. is also a big factor here, right? We're serving all sorts of different student interests across the country. Okay.
And I think about, for example, Darin, my sister-in-law, who is wonderful, is a traveling opera singer. She went to school for vocal performance. She's incredible. She's one of the most renowned people and opera singers in the world. What would be work-based learning for an opera singer, right? So we think about the diversity of experience. We're not going to say, hey, go do an internship, right? That won't make a lot of sense probably in that discipline, right? Or in that industry. So when we think about scale, some of the friction is in exactly that. Like, what would be the right work-based learning experience for people in those disciplines? What works in those industries? Because if we try to say, hey, every education major, go do an internship, maybe they could, and that'd be great. But they also might say, well, I really need to do student teaching, because that's critical to me becoming licensed to teach. So it's about having that nuanced understanding.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense. Melissa, let's talk a little bit more about career guidance. And when institutions hear career guidance, many still think, we're talking about resume review, mock interview, career fairs, but obviously Strada's approach that you've teased out a little bit for me already is broader than that. So how should institutional leaders be thinking about career guidance differently?
Yeah. And all those experiences that you just mentioned are critical and students really, really value them. But I think the key idea that we would advocate for is that they're just not really going to be all that effective if they're just one-off experiences, or students kind of, wait until their senior year to sort of dip a toe in and then sort of want that to work the magic of connecting them to a career. So we are really looking at, how do those kinds of experiences be part of this really connected, integrated experience sort of career guidance and career readiness that students have. That's just foundational to their core activities as students, everything from curriculum to co-curriculars to the kinds of things that Kevin's talking about.
Yeah. Well, and then there's the question of who should own this career guidance, right? So I'm curious, and I can imagine, as Kevin had said, hey, lots of different institutions, a lot of different models here. But yeah, how do you help someone think through like where this fits depending on the type of institution and the needs and goals they have?
Yeah. Well, to answer that question, I'll take a step back maybe and get into a little bit more of how we would define education to career guidance. It's that kind of term. It's sort of clunky, but it's like that idea of connections even in there. It's not just career guidance, but it's connecting education to careers. So a few years ago, Strada convened an advisory group to create a set of guiding principles that ultimately became these principles for education to career guidance. And there's a whole bunch of info about them on our website. They've been endorsed by 21 national organizations. They were drafted by a cross-sector group, higher ed leaders, practitioners, researchers, some solution developers, some workforce folks. And there's really, I think, 3 key ideas embedded in those principles that will give me kind of a roundabout way to get back to answering your question. But one key idea is really that academic progress and career planning go hand in hand. So as students are declaring a major, they're going through these other key academic milestones, they're doing so with their career goals in mind and knowing what those career milestones are along the way that they'll also need to be achieving. The second, and we've already talked about this idea of connection, but that career guidance is really integrated, embedded into every element of being a student. And we've talked about equity and trying to provide this at scale. One of the best ways to do that is to get it into the curriculum, into core required experiences, a first-year experience course, something like that. And then third is that students need information and data to really guide this education to career planning and this decision-making. So they need labor market information for their state, for their region, so they can understand things like industry growth and what a career progress trajectory or a salary trajectory might look like in a certain field. And they need outcomes data as specific as possible to their program, to their major, so they can really, I think, have a concrete way to answer that question of, what do students like me do with this? People who majored in my same major, what did they go on to do with their degree? So that's kind of all the pieces that we think and that we advocate for coming together in this work. There's a lot in there about the what it should all include. There's a little bit about the how it should be provided. But to get back to your question, there's really nothing too prescriptive on the who, like who should be providing it. And that is really by intent. One is to make sure that this framework it can be adapted to different kind of institutional contexts, but also because the answer really is everyone. And when you think about all those components coming together, it really does involve everyone on campus and the institution and the system, and reaching out to the community beyond campus too. Kevin's already talked about the key role of employers. I think that's a key stakeholder group that can really get involved in providing this.
I mean, I feel like the career guidance and work-based learning linkage that we've been talking about really comes together when you're both actually advocating for a fairly strategic and thoughtful approach to both of these ways of thinking. I think what stands out to me is, all of a sudden we've got, institutions saying we want to graduate our students with 2 years worth of work experience in certain degrees. We've got institutions saying that, look, we want to address our retention issues by actually doing more career guidance and work-based learning in year one, to give people a greater sense of, is this really the path that you're on? Like, and if you are, why, right? And so I think you're both kind of echoing.
Like find out now.
Right.
Possible, right? Yeah.
I've had way too many conversations with students where I'm surprised at the and I think this is changing, but even at all different types of institutions, they wait and they get an internship and at the end and go, oh, I don't know that I like this anymore. Right. And that's really, to me, emblematic of why the stuff that we're talking about is so important, and why the kind of transformation we need is pretty holistic in both of your areas. Well, this is great. Like, I'm a huge fan of community colleges. I've spent a lot of time over my career really digging in on that sector of education. As you know, there's been a lot of really great success stories coming out of the community college space, and there's also been a lot of headlines and news at different points about some of the challenges there. But here's an area where they excel. So, often I'm hearing that community colleges are ahead of four-year institutions when it comes to career-connected education. Partly it's core to their mission. But what are community colleges doing that R1s and regional universities could learn from? Like, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, we actually in the quality coaching career guidance space, we have some data on that. So Strada releases an annual report called the State Opportunity Index. You can find all about that on the website too, but it's essentially a framework that states can use to measure progress on connecting education to opportunity. And I bring it up because we've got really great data sets across all these 5 focus areas, including coaching. And that's really what I point to when we start thinking about the value and the strengths of community colleges and doing this career guidance work in particular. So we measure essentially how many students are having access to these experiences. Are they getting the information we think they should have? Are they getting guidance to make that education to career plan? And are they getting support to overcome their obstacles along the way? So we know across all of these, students at community colleges, for the colleges that we were able to survey, are getting all of these experiences at higher rates. The breakdown, it's interesting, is the same across 4-year institutions and 2-year institutions in terms of what are students getting the most of. So they are most likely by far to get that support with overcoming obstacles, sort of navigating barriers, and less so to get those other pieces. But the rates are higher for community college students. And I think, if you just look at one of those elements in particular, we talk about guidance to connect their education to career. Talking to someone who spent a lot of time in community colleges, you say guidance, something that's probably going to come to mind is guided pathways. And this is work that community colleges have been doing for years, and really making sure that students have an academic plan that is aligned to their goals. So I think that's just one example of where we see guidance and the education to career guidance model that we're talking about just build on the strengths of community colleges. I think another and this stretches across a lot of our areas of work, is that faculty at community colleges are more likely probably to have those strong industry connections, to have maybe deeper roots or sort of a longer tenure in industry. And when students go to their faculty for career advice, and we know also from Strada research that students see their faculty at community colleges as a primary source of career advice, those faculty are just going to be able to speak to that, I think, with more detail and more nuance, and kind of provide that information in a really accessible way.
When we're talking about linking together the work-based learning and the career guidance, talk again a little more about how you see these two things working together in an ideal student experience, right? Like, that could be a sequencing thing. That could be the opera singer scenario that you mentioned earlier, where something isn't as necessary. But yeah, how would you link it together when coming at it from the standpoint of the student experience?
I'll start this one and then hand it to Kevin. But I actually just want to sort of maybe kind of put a finer point on something that Kevin was saying earlier about sort of mapping out how these two come together. We're talking about access and we're talking about value. So as Kevin mentioned, we know that one of the barriers for students in having these quality work-based learning experiences is knowing where they are, maybe how to choose. How do I find one? So guidance has a really obvious role there, and hopefully not just here's how you find them, go apply, but actually helping kind of how do you choose that work-based learning experience that is going to be the right for your opera singer dreams or being a teacher or whatever it is. And then also after the fact too, and I think that's where the value piece comes in, making sure that students can reflect on the experience, can think, oh, is this still a path I want to go down? Or what did I learn from this experience skill-wise? It kind of builds up my skill portfolio. How do I kind of make the most of these new social capital connections I have now? So it's really kind of, I think about it as sort of an access and value value add, I guess, for these experiences?
Very well said. Not much to add. I think the timing and sequencing it's an important question. It's maybe less important of a question than the quality of the guidance or the experience that you're getting. So if I were advising an institution, I would say that's a very important question. Let's start with actually the quality of the experience and what you want the experience to be, and then we'll think about where does that get sequenced in the student experience. When it comes to work-based learning, the one thing I would talk about from a timing perspective is for employers, work-based learning is in some cases a strategy for entry-level hiring. So from a timing perspective, we would want to think about that experience happening in the sequence that's going to align for that employer to make the hire, right? Whether it's a year in advance, 6 months in advance, 3 months in advance. So that's the element of timing that I think might be most important for institutions to consider, and might not be the most obvious one all the time because it's not necessarily in their control when the employer is going to hire, who's going to hire them, what that timeline looks like. But that is a very important voice to bring into the table on thinking about when should we have students do some of these things. It would be very important to consider what the employer's hiring timeline and needs are in that.
I'm curious, can you give me an example of an institution that you feel like is sort of integrating both of your areas really well, and someone that comes to mind as you start to think through, like either through the coaching that you guys have done or just the ways that you've been impacted by really interesting stories at institutions? I'm just curious who can we call out as a success? And I know there's way too many to call out, but just examples that you think might surprise the listener would be great.
Well, I guess I would kind of take a step back and think about, we've really seen exciting things happening when institutions or systems are kind of designing these things from the start together. So we've been lucky enough to do a lot of work, for instance, with the Louisiana Board of Regents. They are working on a career alignment plan that is bringing together career guidance, career advising, how that happens at all of their institutions in the state, as well as work-based learning, and having employers have a really, really strong and very valued voice at the table there. So I think there's something really exciting happening there in terms of, not starting from scratch. That's something I would probably say of all the institutions we work with. They're not starting from scratch. There's things that are already in place, but really looking at kind of what's working, how do we operationalize, how do we get this working across our systems, and really intentionally design quality coaching and work-based learning together.
It makes a ton of sense that the Board of Regents, the state, would be a great place to begin this, right? This is where all of our legislatures are, regardless of their political affiliation, saying, I want to see more people graduate and get good jobs in this state, right? And stay and work here. So yeah, that's a great example. Kevin, anything come to mind for you?
Well, I'm going to take it to another state. The state of Virginia is doing some very interesting work around work-based learning holistically. They've had an initiative in play for quite a number of years where a goal is to have every student have a paid internship or other really high-quality work-based learning experience across the state. And they've appropriated funds to enable that to happen, which has resulted in grants directly to institutions to sort of think about the strategy and capacity. And recently, funding has also landed with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. So they are working on sort of building up the supply from the employer side. And some of the funds are directed specifically toward employers who are smaller organizations to help them actually give the wages to the students. So it's a real interesting enabling strategy as well as sort of a bold goal. And as a result, many of the institutions are doing some wonderful things to expand access and think about how policy and practice can change to ensure that every student is getting that experience. So just a very interesting model of thinking about, like, how does this work, right, at a larger scale?
And Darin, what you already said too, I would just underscore is so important, like aligning it to what states are already trying to do and helping. I think a lot of what we do at Strada is really helping them see how these practices will help reach that state level goal. I mean, if not every state has a specific goal around work-based learning, like how do we help them see the connection? Okay, here's what you are trying to do. Here's how work-based learning or guidance or whatever it will be a part of that.
Well, let's go back to this world of data, Melissa. So earlier you touched on clear outcomes as one of Strada's focus areas. When institutions have both robust guidance and work-based learning, what do you think becomes possible with the data that wasn't possible before? Like what are we unlocking with data now? And is that, you can talk about that at the state level or at the institution level. I'm just curious though, what your take is.
Yeah, I would probably start by talking about what we want to make sure gets measured. And that is really wanting to take a close look at post-completion outcomes, which are really difficult to measure in a lot of ways, especially sort of the further out that a student gets from graduation. But when we talk about post-completion outcomes, a couple of things specifically we're looking at is, does a student have a job right out of college, or at least within those first 5 years right out of college that requires a degree? So looking at some kind of alignment there and being able to look at return on investment, or students getting a strong return on their investment in education. That is complex to measure, and it takes a really long time if you want to think about measuring it and trying to explore any linkage between the kinds of things that we're talking about. Even building these programs, building these approaches takes a long time. To have those measurements in hand takes a long time too. So we would also, want to be thinking about what are some of the leading indicators. First of all, what can we tell about how students are engaging in work-based learning, how they're engaging in career guidance or quality coaching, whether that's meetings with an advisor or taking a career designated course or doing career activities on their LMS or whatever it is, like trying to get a handle on all these experiences are taking place. How are students engaging with them, I think, is a big piece of what can be measured. And then looking at timely progress to degree, things like how often is a student changing their major? What does that help us understand about what it sets them up for in terms of their later career success? So it's a combination, I think, of data that needs to come from outside the institution and data that institutions can track as well. But if you have all that in combination, I think then you can really look at, okay, what are sort of those most meaningful experiences, or where we can see the strongest connection. And also, ultimately, I think students can have access to that and help drive them toward, oh, okay, I get it. Like, people have been talking to me about work-based learning, but now I get it. Like, I see the value of it. And that's just going to be, I think, another layer of motivation to get connected to those experiences.
Kevin, did you have anything to add to that?
Only one thing, which Melissa kind of touched on the end there, which is a big question that I think students frequently ask is, what are the career outcomes of this program? But more importantly, what is it like for me? So to be able to have an institution say, here's what students who finished with a psychology major at this institution are doing and where they are right now, it starts to become more real for a student. And if there's a little bit of here's the pathway they took to get there, right? Now things become more connected to me as a human, right? And I can see that a lot more clearly when it's really more personalized to me. So it is, to Melissa's point, it is not easy to capture all this and put it all together. It is not typically like what is baked into the infrastructure, today. But as we strive to get it closer and closer to that being the case, we have the chance for more of that personalized support to exist.
This all kind of makes me think of, in California, they have it's an initiative, I think, called the Career Passport. And just thinking about sort of the data and the outcomes, right? But and then I think several states have, like a skills wallet or like whatever. Like there's trying to be really deliberate about helping take anybody's, experiences, college or otherwise, maybe military experience, prior work experience, and sort of wrap that in. I know that it's not exactly the space that we're all in right now or talking about, but I'm just curious, is Strada doing anything in that space right now around any of these state initiatives that are really kind of deliberately trying to track those skills across a population of learners?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of learner mobility record, LER, like it's all kind of in this same world. And that's absolutely something that we're involved in, and that we have a team of folks working on. And we do, work across different states on different kinds of initiatives. So this is definitely part of it. And I think it is so critical to kind of get, like, how do we make it all visible? Like, how do we make these skills and experiences visible to the learner, visible to the employer, building up some skills and awareness around how to discuss these and kind of put these experiences and skills forward, like on that employment journey. I think it's all actually really connected to what we're talking about.
And if I could bring an example to life of like a place where I see that kind of connection happening, we talk a lot about like certificates and certifications, which are, similar but not always perfectly the same. And the skills-based, industry-based certificates and how those things may help students with developing discrete and specific skills. Pairing that with, an academic major, which may be aligned to sort of more broad skills, right? So there's a lot of movement in that area, which is great. And Strada is certainly interested in that, working on that, thinking about those things. And how this might connect actually is the University of California system has launched an initiative called Degree Plus. And what they're doing is taking a student who's in a degree program, they're enabling that student to take an industry-based certification from one of their extension schools. And then they are also giving that student an internship that's connected to that industry-based certificate. So now you have, hypothetically, right, the broad skills of a degree, the specific skills from an industry-based certification, and the work experience, right, that gives you sort of a lot of things to think about and what your career could be and a launch pad for it. So these things are absolutely not disconnected. They are very much together. And there's just one example of like where that might all actually come together.
And Texas is doing a lot of work too at incorporating the micro-credentials and certificates into learning.
There's so much that we could cover here, guys. And I'm actually trying to give you back some of your day, because we're going to go on forever if I go through everything that I want to ask you. But
we'll take that as a good sign, Darin.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, but I want to come back to the partner ecosystem. And I mean, it's what I hear in one way or another in conversations at institutions when they're having a real strategic conversation around this kind of topic, is that institutions can't do it alone. Like there's got to be a mix of partners brought in. It's not to say that the partners need to take over every aspect of the curriculum. It's just to say that in order to scale this in a meaningful way, in a transformational way, to meet some of these state standards and initiatives, you've got to do it with some degree of partnership. So I guess based on what you're seeing across Strada's portfolio, your grant recipients, the states that you're working in, what does a healthy partner ecosystem look like? If I can be so bold as to just ask that.
I think that takes a few forms, right? None of these things are going to be exactly the same in every place. What I would say is or can be a key ingredient to these healthy ecosystems is organizations that might fall under a bucket you might call intermediaries. So that could be state chambers or workforce groups, or well-funded nonprofit organizations that exist and are well-established, structured, have a strategic plan and thought around how are we bridging education and workforce? How are we bringing the insights from these two parties together and helping them align, right, in different ways? So a very strong or well-funded intermediary network can really help make that ecosystem sing. Because I don't think education and employers are really as far apart as sometimes we might fantasize or dramatize that they are. But certainly there are conflicting viewpoints, right, on what the purpose of education might be, or how fast we think this person should finish the program, and should they work first or go to school first. So having another party help navigate some of those things sometimes can be very healthy and helpful. However, that can also be well established by a really smart and thoughtful leader at an institution who's just minded to think that way too. So I would offer that intermediaries or intermediary-like thinking in organizations can be really helpful to those partner ecosystems and those being strong.
Melissa, any follow-up on that idea as well from you?
Yeah, I might just add a couple thoughts thinking about a different kind of partner. And you mentioned our portfolio, and we started talking about some of the solutions that we work with, and just sort of, I think I sort of mentioned it earlier too, but one thing that I do and spend a lot of time doing and try and kind of piece together sort of how to make these partnerships work well is really listening to institutions about how are they choosing a particular solution and what makes it work well when it does. I mean, one thing that I hear institutions say over and over is that they want to see evidence of impact, but they want to see how it works for an institution really similar to them. So thinking about like, what are these kinds of networks of institutions that might have similar conditions that is going to potentially make them kind of build or approach this ecosystem in the same way is really helpful. And I think, specifically thinking about some of the tech providers or solutions that institutions are working with, I think there's really a role for the institution and the solution provider to really work together in creating that healthy ecosystem. A lot of learning and listening and kind of trying to tailor the solution the institution's needs is important. But also, I think when institutions are working with partners, whether it's a solution provider or something else, I mean, to really, I think, intentionally integrate whatever that is going on with the core functions of the institution. Like if there's a solution that institutions have access to, sometimes they don't even know, not everyone's using it. Students aren't really meaningfully, driven toward it or being asked to use it in a different way. So there's just, I think there needs to be a way of kind of looking at who are the players in that particular ecosystem, making sure that each are kind of aware and responsive to the different kinds of needs and priorities, but making sure that it all comes back to students, right? So making students are really in the best position to leverage all of these different kind of partnerships that their institutions are putting together.
Yeah, I love that. Well, let me just get you guys one last question before I let you go. And it's really more the 5-year horizon on this, right? The important work you guys are doing these days, the things that you're seeing momentum towards either at state or institution levels. But if we're really making progress on integrating meaningful career guidance and work-based learning throughout the student experience, as you're talking about, what changes in student outcomes? Like what do you think is possible beyond what's happening today? Melissa, I want to ask you to go first on that one.
Yeah, this is such a fun one. Thanks for just kind of letting us like dream about the possibilities with you. I think for like Kevin and I and everyone at Strada spends a lot of time thinking about this. I mean, one is the outcomes piece, which you mentioned, which you talked about, looking at post-completion outcomes in particular. I mean, continuing to build on access efforts and completion, but looking at those post-completion outcomes. And for me, I think that kind of alignment piece is really, really important there. Students being able to move on to a career that requires their degree, that leverages everything that they spent that time in college learning about. But I think about it too in terms of almost kind of a culture at the institutions, the way that students can approach their experiences. I mean, this kind of career alignment piece is not going to be extra or something that you seek out. It's really baked into the student experience. And I think that'll, I have a background teaching students, and I kind of reflect back on that and think about these questions that I would hear come up, like, do I want to major in something I care about? Do I want to, focus on career preparation? And I think like, let's get rid of that question, because everything, if this comes to life, like everything is going to be career aligned. So like, get rid of that question. You've got the career alignment no matter what. And then it kind of creates the space to return to those questions of like purpose and meaning and what gives me that sense of fulfillment, and getting rid of this like false choice or tension between the two.
Usually, and this is the case again, hard to top Melissa Leavitt, or hard to even add. But I think what you said at the end there, Melissa, is sort of what would be in my dream scenario, is the idea that we're focusing on like your purpose, and what's meaningful to you. And I think when I'm answering this, I'm thinking a lot about myself at an institution, working in career services, talking with students all the time about these things, and physically feeling the underlying stress and tension that they feel when it feels like guesswork, when it feels like I don't know how to do this and I don't know where to turn and I don't have the information. That is stressful for them, because this is they do acknowledge the seriousness of that moment and wanting to have a better life and wanting to get a great outcome. That is so important. So if we embed these things and we make them part of the experience, my hope is that we lessen that stress. I don't know if it'll go away forever. There will always be difficult moments and applications and interviews and tensions. And, I didn't get that thing I wanted. But hopefully we can reduce a lot of that so people just have more space to be having fun, to be thinking about a meaningful life, right? To be thinking about some of those other things that also really matter to us. Because this tension I don't think has to exist with such the veracity that it does sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, stress and tension are part of life. What we're trying to avoid isn't a I think what we're trying to help somebody with is to go through that process and confidently come out of on the other end,
right,
with the proper tools to think through these decisions in a safe environment that's going to support them through it.
it's
I
unrealistic to
love
think they
that.
won't have stress. There will be stress. That's
Yeah.
healthy in
Yeah.
life. It's not a bad thing, but does it need to be guesswork for people? Does it need to be right? What are the unnecessary points of stress and tension that if we designed the system a little bit differently, we would definitely take away some of those questions or those unknowns for students, because we do have, the answers to some of these things that we could be helping them get to.
And helping them get through that journey without feeling like they have to put aside, like, part of who they are, what they care about, or a subset of their goals or anything like that. But it can all come together, and I think be honored if we really just kind of like career readiness is going to be a part of it no matter what. So stop worrying about that piece, like you're on the right track there, and just think about what is really driving you and what's the impact that you want to have.
Melissa, Kevin, you guys, I'm so glad we did this. It's such a great way to start to enter into some of the conversations that we'll be having in this series on experiential learning that get into talking to the academic leaders at all sorts of different institutions. And you're also making me think that I actually need to explore, as a result of this, I need to explore having some conversations with some people at Board of Regents and or state level roles, because I think what you're really helping me see is that this is a strategy that in many cases has launched there. And so let's go hear it from them. Right. So anyway, I'm learning so much today from you. I could keep you on another hour. I won't do that. But thank you very much for taking the time and doing this with me today.
Thank you. I think we had a blast. I don't want to speak for Kevin, but Kevin and I spend a big chunk of every day kind of talking about these kinds of things. So good to be able to talk about it with you, Darin. And this is great. Thank you.